Well, good morning, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Luke Christie, and I am the development manager here at Bobby Dodd Institute. And it is my pleasure to welcome you all to today's webinar, Understanding Your Psychological Evaluations. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. First, thank you again for joining us. Please be sure to keep yourself muted so that we can keep the sound quality clear. And a reminder that the webinar is being recorded for you to listen to later and for others who are not able to be here. And that recording will be sent out to everybody registered within 7 days. Usually it's within a day or two, but give it up to 7 days. And finally, we do want you to use the chat to ask questions or provide commentary, but please refrain from sharing personal information as this chat is accessible to all attendees, and any personal details you share will be visible to everyone. This webinar is one in a series of webinars brought to you by our Empowers team. And if you're not familiar with BDI Empowers, this is the programmatic division of BDI where we provide a continuum of support for all ages, stages, and levels of need for people with disabilities and challenges. And our comprehensive portfolio of programs includes behavioral health, family support services, benefits navigation, work incentives planning and assistance, multitude of job and career services, and our Georgia Community Trust. So without further ado, it's my privilege to turn it over to our speakers today, Dr. Brandon Printup, our clinical director here on the Empower side, and Anna Mackey, director of program services. And I will let them introduce themselves and take it away.
All right, so good morning, y'all. My name is Brandon Printup. I'm the director of clinical services for Bobby Dodd Institute, and I have over 15 years of experience, just like working a variety of like different facilities. Most of my background is in like hospitals, like probably like Ridgeview, Peachford, that specialize in like specific behaviors, anxiety, depression, mood-related behavior concerns. And then I have a specialty in trauma and grief and loss. And today we want to try to talk about psychologicals. And Anna Mackey is going to be working with me. So Anna, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I'm Anna Mackey. I'm the Director of Program Services at BDI. I've been working in the Benefits Navigation Program here since 2016. And the reason I wanted to be part of this session today is that psychological evaluations are some of your most critical forms of documentation to submit to government agencies for benefits. So I'm delighted to be here in support of this program. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so before we begin, we want to talk about like, and this is for y'all to kind of go through the chat to say like, to discuss like, what is a psychological evaluation? Like, could y'all type in the chat, like, what is a psychological evaluation? Do we know what it is? That's just a question to the general group. And you can type the comments in the chat. Someone says, does everybody have one they love? And also too, is it current? So let me ask you this. This is a question to the group. Why are psychological evaluations necessary? And that's something y'all can type in the comments in the chat. So psychological evaluations are necessary to do a couple of things. They're necessary to kind of like provide a diagnostic plan and support, and also to assess functioning level, and then also to, depending on the type of psychological, and we'll talk about that a little in depth, it has different functions and capabilities to kind of tell people's cognitive levels and predictive factors and abilities. The next question to y'all is, who can complete a psychological evaluation? And post it in the chat, who do y'all think can complete a psychological evaluation? And let me preface this, in the state of Georgia, who can complete a psychological evaluation? Because in different states, different people can complete a psychological evaluation. All right. So psychological evaluation completed by a PhD. Yeah. Someone says, Elizabeth said, clinical psychologist, psychiatrist. Yes. Those are people. Go back to the other slide, please, Luke. Slide 8. So we want to rewind and say, what is a psychological evaluation? A psychological evaluation is a measuring of observation of the following factors. Well, the first thing is behavior, cognitive, and historical factors. When we talk about behavior, that's how the person's acting currently, past, present, and possible future. Cognitive is like the function levels that we talked about. That would be like an IQ test, our batteries to see like the person's function level. Historical factors is things that have happened in the past, function levels surrounding behavior concerns, maybe having poor attendance, poor behaviors in school, poor behavior concerns related to stressors. Anna, do you have any feedback surrounding what is a psychological evaluation?
No, I think you hit on the key piece. We really want to make sure that we know exactly where that person is functioning. I think this becomes an issue when you're requesting an updated psychological evaluation for an upcoming IEP or for other benefits. You know, if that evaluation is dated, then we may be using scales for children instead of adults. How do we know what that person's current level of function is without some of these quantitative and qualitative measurements?
Gotcha. So next slide for me, Luke, please. So a psychological evaluation. So in the state of Georgia, this is tricky. So what I've put on here is, so I'm gonna be transparent. And so one of the things I want to say before we begin this slide presentation and discuss, these are just suggestions, and this is just a conversation to stimulate conversation, provide support and resources to y'all. These are not all be all, and so it is suggestions and feedback just based upon my experiences and Anna's experiences. So we want to say that because other people may review this in a different way, a different light, and we want to make sure that we're transparent with that. That said, in the state of Georgia, a person that completes a psychological evaluation is a psychiatrist, psychologist, and then also too, we have school psychologists. So what you would normally get is, being transparent again, you will get a psychometrist or a psychometrician, which is a master's level person that will administer the tools to complete a psychological test. Then the psychologist will see them to complete and to follow back up with the batteries of tests too, and they will co-sign the assessment. And then the purpose that will be look at like memory, thought, processing, and behaviors. So that said, those are the people that will be can complete it. And then also too, you'll see a difference in a psychological done by a slight difference between a school psychologist and a psychologist. But you'll see in like a lot of school systems, you'll see like some of the school psychologists do really, really good work. And then guess what? Some of the school psychologists, their background is an EDS. So that's an intern between a doctoral and a master's. And they do really, really good work. And there's certain counties that do really good work. The dilemma you face is when you get a psychological done from the school system, the process that it takes to navigate through that is not easy. It's a long process. So that's a 6 month to a year process that you probably get the results back. So, all right, next slide. And we kind of went over this a little bit. These are like the purpose to identify. The purpose of the psychological evaluation is to look at these 4 factors: functioning. And Anna talked to like, what's the person's function level? diagnosis. Like that diagnosis is kind of like, do they have depression? Do they have autism? Do they have bipolar? Do they have any mood-related concerns? And then also to treat specific conditions. And those conditions can be related to, and we're going to talk about is their adaptive functioning. We're going to talk about their ability from a cognitive standpoint, from a mental standpoint, and a social standpoint, and also too from a behavior standpoint, where they have inventories that they're assessed and to kind of look at that information. And then the last one is key is provide a recommendation for further action. So basically, in the last, what you'll see is in the last couple of pages of psychological, the behavior, the recommendations that are required that you want to look at too. So Anna, do you have any, hold on one second, Luke. Anna, did you have any feedback about that slide?
No, I think you're exactly on point. Absolutely. Now, there, just in terms of my interaction with families, when I'm recommending a new psychological evaluation, I may make specific recommendations, like based on our interactions, I'm making some observations of blank. So I may suggest to you that you ask your psychologist for a specific assessment, like as, really think you might want to do an autism rating scale or something along those lines. So those diagnoses are very important as we're talking about government benefits. So we want to make sure that we have a clear and comprehensive and accurate set of diagnoses.
All right, thank you. So when we break down the psychological assessment, this chart kind of is symbolic of what it does. Psychological assessment, measurement, responses. It does include responses that are kind of tracked in the back that you'll see. Their tests, their question inventories, and then you're going to get a lot of question inventories depending on what the test is. And then too, the tests have a set of rules, and then what we have is what's a confidence interval. The confidence interval is the range from which your score falls into. And then it goes even deeper to the percentile. And then if you fall in the 90th percentile, that means based upon the test, you're at a higher level of functioning versus like the 10th percentile, you tend to be a little bit lower. And then what you can do is when the person completes the test, you'll see a graph, or you'll see like a chart, and it kind of tells you like what the range is, and the range tells about the functioning too. And then with anything that you see on a psychological test, you can always ask the psychologist like what's going on. And I think sometimes we don't have enough dialogue with the psychologist or the person that administers the test, because guess what? They provide it's our job to get a clear picture from a diagnostic standpoint. And that clear picture, we want to give it as accurate as possible, because guess what? One of the things I didn't put in the slide, but there are a lot of psychologists that do what is called a screening. That's not a psychological evaluation. That is a screening. And they do the screening because we're in an era that we deal with insurance. And so insurance only pays for certain things. So you have to tell them, like, this is what we need. This is what I want to have tested. And so as Anna will tell you, there's certain things from a benefits standpoint that you have to have. And we'll start talking about that because it's important. And guess what? You're paying for a service. And then so you want to make sure you're getting a service that's valid. And because what you don't want to have is to have another psychological done again too. Because the general range, if you're paying out of pocket for a psychological, is between the cheapest is $350 up to $1,500 or $2,000 without insurance. And with insurance, it can vary. And then the other thing that we are having is we're having a shortage in psychologists now. So it's hard for us because we're being forced in managed care to kind of cater treatment towards a certain way. And so the psychologists now that once we're doing the work, now don't do it through insurance, they want private pay. And the really good people, they're a month in the hole. It's going to be a month or two before you can get in there and see them to do an evaluation. So, Anna, any feedback or any thoughts?
No, that's spot on.
All right. So this is key. Why is the psychological evaluation so important? it's important in a lot of ways. The biggest way to interpret data and results to determine like function level, behavior concerns, and challenges. But for our standpoint, it's important for a lot of things. Say, for instance, you have a kid that has ADHD. You would want a psychological test to kind of really see if that is the case, because guess what? ADHD presents similar to anxiety, similar to depression, and guess what? If you have a history of trauma, it presents similar to that. By getting a psychological test, you can see whether or not that is really true, and it gives a good prescribed course of treatment. And also, too, it helps with navigating your person's function level. Like, as Anna will talk about, like, why is it important from her standpoint in the benefits piece, it's a little bit different because it's something to help with future funding and resources for life. So Anna, could you tell them, like, from your standpoint, why psychological evaluation is important?
Absolutely. I think when I'm looking at helping an individual apply for benefits, some agencies like Social Security Administration are very clear about what medical documentation is going to be required to get that medical determination of disability, and it's going to be based on your diagnosis. So having a psychological evaluation does two things. A, it confirms the diagnosis, but what it also does is it speaks to the impact. You know, how does this condition impact, and what recommendations are going to be made to help promote a better quality of living for this individual. And when you're working with Social Security, for many conditions, we have to prove diminished mental residual functional capacity. And that means the burden of proof is on us to show the severity and impact of that diagnosis. So the psychological evaluation is so important. I'm jumping up and down. It's that important to have a good current evaluation that speaks to both the diagnosis and how it's impacting that individual.
Right. And just to piggyback on that, it's important also to get a bona fide diagnosis. Because guess what? We're in the field of counseling, and in the counseling arena, it's a little bit different. We're like we're like a fuzzy wuzzy type people. We like lovey, touchy feelings, thoughts, whatever. But guess what? A psychological provides evidence-based practices and data with recommendations to support findings. And so, say for instance, if I have a kid that's having some scholastic problems, then guess what? A psychological is important because what it does is look at the cognitive functioning piece, in addition to looking at like any deficits from a learning difference standpoint. And then by that, we can get accommodations to support that person to do a 504 plan or an IEP to better enhance him or her chance of functioning in school, and also to improve socialization, because that's what we want to do. So that's why it's also important for a psychological evaluation. So next slide, please, Luke. So these are some sample instruments that are really important, and they serve different purposes. And then, so one of the biggest ones is the Wechsler's Intelligence Test, the WASI. And it's important that we talk about that because that age range goes from later adolescence to adult. It's important we talk about it because guess what? If you have a kid that's 16 or 17 and they did a WISC, which is the Wechsler's intelligence for a child, that's not appropriate. And guess what? That makes any type of thing that you're applying for invalid. And then what you may get, you're not gonna get your return on your investment. And then you're gonna have to get another psychological. Standard practice indicates that you should probably have a psychological done every 2 years, just because. And then depending on your funding source, back in the day, Medicaid would only pay for every 2 years. But what's going on with them now is they're not paying for certain instruments. And like another instrument that's key that you may see somebody use is a KBIT, Kaufman's Brief Intelligence Instrument, which is key for, it does similar stuff that like the WASI does, but it's not as intense. The WASI is the model. It's like the Tesla or the Mercedes-Benz of cars. It's for testing. And so these instruments are used for IQ testing too. And then with IQ testing, we have a range. It's important for what we do from a benefit standpoint that the IQ testing is important. It's really key. So, Anna, do you have any feedback on this one?
Right. I just want to reiterate how it's okay for you to ask the psychologist about specific assessments. You're the consumer. Now they're the professional, but there's no reason why you can't say I would prefer a Wechsler's to be used in this case, because when I'm looking at the results of these different evaluations, it could be as broad a range as 10 points difference. So, because I'm in the business of trying to secure benefits, I'm trying to get the documentation that's going to show the most severe impact. I've seen some psychologists kind of soft shoe on scores that are lower. I had one evaluation where they put the scores in a footnote, and it's like, let's just call it what it is. If we have, an intellectual disability, let's just put here's the full scale IQ right here front and center. And again, because we are using these evaluations to secure benefits, I would rather have an assessment that's a little more strong, where I'm going to get a score that's going to meet more clearly that criteria than assessments that are a little soft. Like I think a Stanford Binet, in my opinion, this is only my opinion. I think things like a differential, the Stanford Binet, I think those are a little soft. I think the scores that you get there are going to be higher than if you used a Wechsler's.
And so the feedback I always tell people to research the person that's doing the testing, research the psychologist, because guess what? If you were sick with an ailment, or if you had a terminal illness, you're going to research the surgeon. You're going to research that. You got to do the same accountability for the person that's doing the psychological test, because at the end of the day, it's the accountability piece too. And then one of the things that you can do to find out what test are valid, you can go to the American Psychological Association, and then to the other thing is Pearson. Pearson, Pearson, has all the testing instruments that you can look at too. And then you can ask questions like, what is your ability to make diagnostic criteria based upon X, Y, and Z? And they should be able to ask you those questions. If a psychologist doesn't feel like they can answer your question, then guess what? Before you even start, you should just move your booty up and just take that turn and say, thank you very much for your time. I need to go elsewhere. Because I think that's the piece you want to make sure that this is done and this is over, because this process, depending on a person's function level, it is very stressful. It is stressful. It's not easy, because some instruments focus on cognitive ability where you're doing puzzles and stuff too that are very stressful, and they're not time sensitive, but they're just very stressful for people's function level. And then you're going to have to come back a couple of times too, based upon the test. If someone says they get the whole test done in one day, nah, you don't want to deal with them. So next slide, please, sir. All right, so this we talked about the full scale IQ. And so the full scale IQ, there's a verbal IQ, and a verbal IQ, you have the comprehension, and in the comprehension, you have vocabulary test, vocabulary, similarities, informations, comprehension. That's one part of the verbal piece. That's very important, because this tells you what they're testing. It tells you the range and all the stuff too. Then we go to working memory. Then it tells you like, okay, arithmetic, digital span, lettering sequence, number sequence, all that stuff is important. And this is all under this side too. Then the next thing is we got performance IQ, PIQ. Then you look at perceptual, Organizational index, that's basically looking at pictures, completion, blocks, matrix, and reasoning. And so you're going to get some tests that are going to be puzzles that you have to put together. And then the next one is processing speed. And so that's coding. That's how you deal with numbers and stuff too. And guess what? There's going to be different instrument tools that a person uses. There's some instrument, you can research the instrument tools and look at the validity of the instrument tools too. So, all right, next slide, please. So when we talked about like IQ, this is what the IQ scales are symbolic of. And so when we look at this, from 160 and above is considered genius. Then from 148 to 164 is kind of like superior intelligence. When we look at these things are very important because guess what? They help determine a person's functional level. And a person's functional level can change. Back in the day when I used to work at a hospital, most of my population was borderline intellectual functioning or borderline deficiencies. And so based upon that, that was my general population. And so I can tell you that on paper, what a person may look like on borderline, but they may not really be borderline because it may just be they have a deficit in certain areas. It may be like their processing speed. It may be that's what's bringing the score down. But in other areas, they're high functioning. My colleague Ann is going to talk to you from a standpoint of the function level, why this IQ piece is really important from the benefit standpoint. That's different. So I'm just giving you to it from like this is the data, this is it. But Anna's going to tell you why this is important. So Anna, please.
Sure. So again, when we're looking at applying for government benefits, and for purposes of this conversation, let's speak specifically to state departments. So the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities. When you're applying for benefits like a now comp waiver or family support services, they want to determine if you have an intellectual disability or a condition closely related to an intellectual disability. And so having a full scale IQ score is going to help them with their determination that you're eligible for these benefits. So typically what we're looking at are cutoff scores. So generally the DBHDD is looking at a cutoff score of 70, meaning if your score is between 70 and 79, that's going to be viewed as more borderline. Anything that's below 70 is going to be viewed as likely to be an intellectual disability. The thing is most of these agencies are not looking wholly at one assessment. They're looking at that assessment in relation to other assessments. So the DBHDD, for example, is going to look at the full scale IQ, and then they're going to assume that if there are areas of clinical significance, that evaluation should also include an adaptive function assessment. And I've seen instances in which an individual was denied even when their score was in that borderline or even slightly below that borderline, like a full scale IQ of 68. So that's below the cutoff score, right? But because the psychologist opted not to include an adaptive function assessment, then the DBHDD said, well, if the clinician thought that there was a real issue, standard practice is to also do an adaptive function. And so since they didn't, we can assume that this individual is okay. And therefore their disabling condition is not severe enough to warrant services. Yikes. So I think a lot of times when we are working with the psychologist, we need to have open communication about why you're getting that evaluation, what you hope to attain with that, and have a candid conversation about what assessments are going to be used. There are a lot of different assessments out there. There's a Connors assessment for ADHD. There are assessments related to anxiety and depression. And these are important assessments to hone in on specific diagnoses. But for purposes of government benefits, the DBHDD in particular is mostly interested in full-scale IQ and adaptive function.
Thank you. Next slide, sir, please. So
That's my favorite.
So we're talking about the test, the Violent Adaptive Behavioral Scale. So it's a variety of instruments that can be used to assess the diagnosis and evaluate the special needs of an individual. And they focus on, guess what? Anna's favorite word, adaptive behavior. And that's like everyday change, life and stuff too. This test right here is very important. And so it kind of, and as we progress, Anna will talk to you about the importance of the test and why, from a benefit standpoint, what does it really mean? So next slide, sir. So VABS is what we're going to call the violence today, VABS. So we're looking at the whole process from preschool to 18, but we don't even have to do it. We don't even have to go with 18. It can go indefinite. And so the domains are communication domain. That's self-explanatory, how they communicate or whatever. Daily living, just the things they do daily, socializations, how they socialize with people, and then guess what? Fine motor skills. So, Anna, do you have any feedback about that?
Yeah, and this slide here is perfect. Y'all, this is why I love Vineland, because look how it lists 5 distinct domains. So these domains do 2 things. First, in terms of determining eligibility, again, let's say the DBHDD, and they've looked at the full-scale IQ. Now they're looking at adaptive behavior. They want to see deficits in at least 3 domains, right? So they're going to look at a global adaptive composite score, but then they also want to look at specific scores within those domains and even the subdomains. And so the more information you have, the better it is that you're able to show to government agencies, whether it's DBHDD or Social Security Administration, what the impact of this diagnosis is on that individual's day-to-day operations. This is revealing how does the person function in our community? What supports are necessary because of deficits? So this is really critical information. So as a general rule, when I'm assessing an evaluation for eligibility, I'm looking at for an intellectual disability or a condition closely related to an intellectual disability, but I'm also looking for this adaptive function score, and I'm looking for global adaptive composites that are below 70. Now, as a general rule, you're going to have a global adaptive composite that the sum of all the domains are going to reflect in that adaptive composite. And so you should normally see, like if you have a global adaptive composite that's in the 60s, you should see all the scores within the domain also in the 60s. But every now and again, we see a little bit of disparity. And I had a case just this week where I had an individual whose global adaptive composite was 68, but the communication was below 70. The ADLs, the daily living, is below 70, but the socialization was above 70. And even though the global adaptive score was below 70, the DBHDD denied that application because they had one of those domains that was over that 70 points. So knowing your evaluation and knowing what these scores are is very critical, because I really like to make sure if we're doing an initial application for benefits, particularly with the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities, I want to feel very confident in the documentation that we're providing, because if you get a denial, it's a lot harder to then come back and say and get another evaluation that may show the scores that they're looking for, but they're going to kind of dig in their heels and look at that initial evaluation. So I always want to be very cautious. I tend to work out of an abundance of caution, and I tend to not encourage an application for services unless we have clear documentation of eligibility. And the full scale IQ matters, but so does your adaptive function score. So just want to make sure that we're putting all kinds of highlights and jumping up and down about adaptive function, because this is where the rubber meets the road, not only for the DBHDD, but also in showing diminished mental residual functional capacity administration. This document is key.
Gotcha. So Anna already kind of summarized the subdomains. That is pretty self-explanatory, kind of breaks it down. So Luke, could you play the video for like the violence behavior scale?
Vineland Adaptive Behavior Skills, or VABS. VABS is a tool to measure adaptive behavior. And it also supports the diagnosis of intellectual and developmental disabilities. VABS is used with people aged 0 to 90 years. Now, areas of application. So the Vineland helps you perform a variety of tasks. For example, it measures adaptive behavior of individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, autism spectrum disorders, ADHD, post-traumatic brain injury, hearing impairment, and dementia Alzheimer's disease. Additionally, it's also used to determine eligibility or qualification for special services, plan rehabilitation or intervention programs, track and report progress. Now, the skills assessed or assessment scales. So the scales are organized using 3 domains: the communication, daily living skills, and socialization. Now, these 3 correspond to the 3 broad domains of adaptive functioning. In addition, Vineland offers optional motor skills and maladaptive behavior domains for situations in which these areas are of concern. This was all. Thanks for watching.
All right. All right. Thank you, Luke. So basically, that kind of just summarizes everything and kind of reiterates what we just talked about, which is important because we just want to give you some visualization from outside people, outside of us, so you can actually see, like, making sure we're factual. It's kind of like giving you like receipts. So next slide, please, sir. So what does this all mean? So basically, wrapping this thing together is kind of like agencies use psychologicals for different purposes and different things. So we talked about it from a diagnostic standpoint, from a behavioral standpoint, and in addition to kind of like provide support and resources too. I always tell people, like, sometimes we always go by, we trust the expertise of our people that we put in trust, but sometimes we need to like verify that. Like, if your kid's on psychotropic medications, or if someone's want to put them on like an anti-anxiety or anti-depression, you probably want to have a psychological evaluation, because it's important just to see if that's really what it is. Because guess what? Unless the doctor gives them a sense of, give you a behavioral questionnaire, you're not going to know if that's factual. Like I told y'all before, I've seen cases. I had a client, his name was Will. It was alleged that he was ADHD. He was taking concerted 15 milligrams, XR extended release, and he had a booster, which means he got it in the middle of the day. So I asked the mom and dad, I said, have y'all ever thought about taking him off his medication? And also too, what's y'all's threshold with his behaviors? And they asked me why. I said, because I don't know actually if he has ADD or any type of ADHD. And so what I did was did a test. I did a cross-cutting measures to indicate whether he had ADD, and I also I got the parents to fill out the Connors and a Browns. And what we found out, it was not ADD. What it was the sensory related stuff. And so he has sensory overload and he was dysregulated. And so his dysregulation and his anxiety, when too much stimulus was going on, it presented that way. And so that's why it's important to have testing and have people that we partner with. So how often are psychologicals needed to be updated? Every 2 years. It's important every 2 years, unless you don't have to do 2 years unless there's a reason to do the 2 years. If you feel like it's okay and you're not trying to update benefits, then yeah, you need to do it. But 2 years is important, especially if you have someone that has learning differences, learning challenges, then I would say you probably want to do 2 years, because that way you can see trends. You can see the trends of whether the cognitive abilities are getting better or not getting better because you have accommodations. The next thing too is making sure that the instruments are age appropriate. We see a lot of times that the instruments are not really age appropriate, and we talked about that earlier. And then two, making sure that, read the comments, read the information, and read the psychological, and then make sure that we do have people that cut and paste. So making sure that the information is using the right pronouns, right sentence, and is referring to your individual. I cannot stress this enough. And I'm not knocking any of my colleagues in the field, but I'm saying making sure the information is the right information. And then the last part is making sure they're signed and dated. They need to be signed and dated. I know that this is a big thing of contention, but we need to make sure they're signed, because you may get something that's not signed or whatever too. And so for your state of benefits, you want to make sure it's signed. And then Anna's going to tell you what this whole also means from tying it back together from a funding source. So Anna.
My pet peeve is when I have an evaluation and the psychologist has not used an age-appropriate scale. That just sets me off because it's not helping the individual. So one of the things that when I am assessing a case for application, and let's use Social Security Administration as an example in this, it is really hard for me to make a case of somebody's level of function if I have dated information. And it's been many a time that I'm doing an initial screen and we're talking about somebody who's now turning 18. So we're going to apply for SSI benefits. And their last evaluation is when the person was 5. There's a big difference between where that person was at age 5 and where they are now. So we really want to make sure that we're having current relevant assessments so that we can make sure that we can present the best case possible. And it really hurts when I have families who spend a lot of money on getting that updated assessment and the psychologist has reverted to using older assessments, meaning that they're using a child scale instead of that adult's. So having that conversation with the psychologist, being on the same page about what assessments are going to be used is just so critical to this process. This last requirement about making evaluations are signed, this is pretty new and is not the standard practice of a psychologist, because you get your psych eval. What you're going to see on the front page is a lot of that referral information, the date of the evaluation, and as Dr. Brandon indicated, we have a lot of instances in which the individual is tested over the course of 2 or 3 visits and whatnot. So all of those visits are listed up there. And then at the end of the report, and the reports may be, I don't know, 10, sometimes even 20 pages long. They usually sign that report. That's great. But what we also need to see is not only that signature, but the psychologist needs to date the date of that report. That's not standard practice, but that's what we're seeing in some instances in terms of accepting documentation, and specifically where we've seen denials isn't with Social Security. It's not with the DBHDD. It's when we are helping individuals secure employment and they are going to be working on a federal contract, and that employer has to submit documentation to demonstrate that person's disabling condition, and they're requesting that psychological evaluation. And if that evaluation has not been signed and dated, then they're not accepting that evaluation. So that's a fairly new phenomenon that we want to make a public service announcement about, because again, that's not standard practice. So if you look at your psychological evaluation in front of you today, you get to that last page and like, okay, they signed it, and yep, they got their license and number, and all, they didn't date it. Don't get mad at your psychologist, because that's not standard practice, but do ask them to date it, especially if you're getting a new evaluation, to say, by the way, in addition to signing it, we need it dated.
Thank you, Anna. All right. So now we're going to open it up for like questions. So does anybody have any questions at this point in time? Someone said something. Is it evaluation done in one day? So some people try to do it in one day, and I don't really like that school of thought, but I mean, some people do that in one day, but like depending on the instruments and the battery of tests, it's really hard to do them in one day based upon someone's function level. And so you will see some people try to do it in one day, but depending if someone with ADD goes into a test, it's going to be very hard.
Mm-hmm. I like
And
that
someone
question.
says, so someone says, do the test of the client's report. So someone asked about maladaptive behavior and having a negative impact on therapy and social interactions. Then what you would have to do is kind of find sometimes from a therapeutic standpoint, we look at things like as black and white, but you got to find somebody that's more experiential from a therapeutic standpoint and be creative, and it may be more like play or maybe a holistic approach of therapy to engage that stuff too, where the psychological helps to kind of tell you that, okay, maybe talk therapy may not work with that person. And if that's the case, if someone functioning level tends to be a little bit lower, talk therapy may not work. And you may have to ask the therapist, like, what's your method to deal with somebody that is not at that level of functioning? So more experiential, holistic, a lot of play, and then also too a lot of sensory related stuff too. And then how do they engage somebody that's nonverbal?
Right. And I would just like to add that one of the benefits of a psychological evaluation is you're dealing both with quantitative assessments as well as some qualitative language there. So an individual can deny maladaptive behavior till the cows come home, but there may be some evidence of that in some of these scores. These assessments are pretty comprehensive, and it's kind of hard to fake it. There's generally we're going to be able to, or the psychologist is going to be able to determine some invalidity. Like if there are some scoring like this does not make sense, then that brings the validity of the assessment into question, and that's going to be called out in the report. As opposed to if everything is looking right, they're also going to state that as well. So I think that nature there is genuine rigor to these. So even if somebody is, in the course of a conversation denying some things, through the course of these quantitative assessments, it's going to come to light, or it's going to show off as a little wonky and still going to be integrated into the report as such.
So Anna made a valid.
The part about is it solely on the client's report? It depends. It's frequent that when we are in the adjudication process with Social Security application that the adjudicator's looking at all of our information and, I really would like our psychologist to meet with you. And during that process, they're not doing a full-blown psychological evaluation like we've discussed today. They're simply doing a mental status exam, right? So very, very different. But they usually do incorporate a clinical interview with the parent. And in most psychological reports that are robust, that do use a variety of assessments, likewise, they are also having that conversation with other individuals because they're trying to gather as much information as possible in order to place these assessments in some degree of context. So, and I think that's where you often see a self-report, and then you see a parent's report, and so you can do a comparative analysis, and that is usually very compelling information.
Right. And Anna had a great point too, and I'm going to use this word. You can ask them, are we doing a psychological evaluation, or are we doing a screening? And so when the person's face turns red when you ask that term, then you know you got to turn around, because the psychological evaluation is very intense. Like, remember we talk about managed care, which is the insurance companies. So when I first started, I've been in the field for over 20 years. When I first started, a psychological was 15 pages, 12 to 15 pages. Now you may see somebody, I've seen 3 to 4 page psychologicals. And so my question would be, how could it be 3 to 4 pages, and then the interview in itself should be 2 to 3 pages based upon the intensity. And then if you're doing a Connors, or if you're doing a Bass, and if you're doing a Wixler's, those are standards. And then if you do a violin, that's about 15, 20. Those are about 5 instruments that you're doing. So we got to make sure we preserve the integrity of this stuff too. And you're paying for a service. And so again, you can always go to the APA of Georgia, American Psychological Association, and then also to Pearson tells you what instruments are being used. Pearson is like the educational inventory, to where people like doing assessments can order the inventories and look at them too. And then you can even go online and do a compare and contrast. Because we're going to take technology aids to where we can do that. So, any other questions? Our neuropsych is a little different. And so you want to make sure you research them and making sure that they're competent in the instruments that they use too. And then, so that's more of a specialty type psychological. And so and those are a little bit more hard to come by, and those tend to be more intense. And those kind of are ones that you don't have to watch as much, because when someone says they're a neuropsychologist, they're pretty good at what they do. And then in a Metro Atlanta, we don't have that many. And then also too, most psychologists, we don't have as many in there. Since the pandemic, it's almost like an epidemic surrounding mental health services and psychological services. And we can even go a step farther, is that the old doctors that were really good, they have retired. So we have a new breed of people. It's like a transition in mental health right now. We have younger people, and so you got to make sure you research the person, bedside manner, and all that stuff too. I always tell people, even when I used to see people in private practice, my first session is just basically just to assess, see if it's a fit. Your energy may not align with mine, and my energy may not align with yours, and that's okay. We got to hold people accountable on that stuff too. I don't like the word we have to. No, we can research, take time to find somebody that's a good fit, because based upon that recommendation and that data, that's significant. Because even Anna said something that's really key. Like, if the person is starting to see something invalid, or seeing the person not being honest, there's measurements to show, like, if you ask this question wrong and the next one wrong, that means you're not telling the truth. So therefore is the instrument is invalid. So Psychological still can be used for developmental disability. It just has to be key towards the person's functioning level too. And then they'll start what they'll do is they'll do more based upon a parent inventory, and then not self-reports, but inventories from the parent or the guardian, and too they're able to do that too. And then some people like like a true good psychologist would do one thing, and we haven't talked about it: collaboration. If I know this person and seen this person has a therapist and they have a psychiatrist, guess what? Best practice would indicate that I would have a conversation with one of those two people to indicate that and write that in the summary to give good historical information. Because guess what? This is like buying a car. So we got people driving. So we got people that are putting out a hoopty work, and then we got people putting out Mercedes-Benz or Bugatti work. I want the Bugatti, I want the Mercedes-Benz type of work for this too, because it's just very important. And guess what? It's life-changing. So I'm all for psychologicals.
Awesome. We are coming up against the end of our time, so I want to be sure to thank our presenters, Brandon and Anna. Thank you both for your time and expertise today. And then I want to quickly show this slide one more time here at the end. A reminder about some upcoming sessions in this webinar series. So we have another one this afternoon on the power of advocacy in the disability community, and then several slated for October, which will all be very informative and wonderful opportunities to learn more on topics that affect all of your lives and that we deal with every day here at BDI. So I'll leave this up for another minute or two and see if folks have other questions, but just wanted to take this opportunity to say thank you again, and we hope you'll join us for a future session.
Thank y'all again, and have a good weekend and have a good day. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.